For lesson 16, we're going to work with our return function. So this one starts with a code that basically has two random numbers, rand1, rand2, and they want to know what the minimum value is going to be. Now notice, if you run the program right away, the minimum number of 51 and 94 is, but it doesn't tell you what it is. Okay, so what we have to do is we have to expand on this console log message, so that this way we have the ability to see what that minimum value actually is. So here's the function. So we have our minimum value of num1 and num2. So it says if num1 is less than num2, then the minimum is equal to num1. If that's not a true statement, then the minimum is equal to num2. And then it wants us to return the minimum value, okay? So what we need to do is we need to expand here on our console log, all right? So we need to do is, and then after the parentheses, or excuse me, the quotations, we're going to add a plus sign. And then what we need to do is exactly what you can see is being typed in. We need to expand or call our function here. Now, our function has num1 and num2, but we want to make sure that we're actually using what the variables were called. So our variables were called rand1 and rand2, so it's going to be minimum value, open parentheses, rand1, comma, rand2. All right, and once we have that typed in, then we should be able to get our program to actually spit out what the minimum value is. Okay, and you can see the minimum 49 and 24 is 24. The minimum of 76 and 72 is 72. All right, now you might notice a slight flaw in this program, which very rarely shows itself, but it says if num1 is less than num2, then the min's num1, otherwise it's got to be num2. If they are equal, then we run into a slight problem because it's going to tell you the minimum value is automatically num2, even though they're actually the same. For bubble 4, they basically want us to copy the code from the minimum value and adjust it so that it becomes a maximum value, okay? So as we do that here, you can see they created a function for max value, and they left the one for the minimum value. But what we want to do is we want to create a max val function. So we're going to have var max val, and we're just going to leave that, or actually we'll just call it var max, okay? And we're going to leave that blank for now. So now we'll put in our if else statement, just like we had in that minimum value piece. Now, instead of saying if num1 is less than num2, then what we're going to say is if num1 is greater than num2, then what's going to be true? Well, then our maximum value, or our max, is going to be equal to num1. Well, if that statement is not true, so our else, then our max is going to be equal to num2. Okay, now could you have left this less than sign and just kind of flip these statements from the min value? Absolutely. Okay, so now what we need to do is exactly what we had before, and actually, sorry, we need to call our function. So we need to do a return of our max. Return of our max. Okay. So now after we do that, I'm going to go back into text mode here so that I can do what we did last time, which is add our plus sign, and then we want to call our max val function. We'll open that parenthesis, and again, it'll be the same thing. It'll be rand1, comma, rand2. All right. So now that we have it called, this should be able to return our function. All right. Actually, hold on. I have a little error here. Let's see what the error is in 13. Oops. I forgot my space there. So now you can see the maximum of 74 and 68 is 74. The maximum of 17 and 80 is 80. So we created basically the same function that we had before, but instead of finding the minimum value, we found the maximum value. So Bubble 5 wants us to analyze this code and kind of figure out if there are any errors with it. And this goes a little bit back to what I talked about earlier. So it gives us the console logs. The maximum of 2 and 3 is, then it calls the max value 5 and 1, and then 8 and 8. So here's our max val function that we're going to call. So if we run it, we get the max of 2 and 3 is 3. We get the max of 5 and 1 is 5. And we get the max of 8 and 8 is undefined. Okay? So that makes sense because remember what I said earlier. This function here doesn't account for anything being equal. It strictly has num1 greater than num2 and then num1 less than num2. So what we're going to do is to fix this undefined piece, all we're going to do is make this else if less than or equal to. All right, now obviously the maximum value of two numbers that are equal is, they're kind of the same thing, but one of them still technically is the max. So by us adding in that equal sign there and having it be less than or equal to, now it takes that last statement of the maximum of 8 and 8 and it actually spits out a number instead of spitting out undefined. So now we're going to look at another, what's called a constrain function. And what the constrain function does is basically it allows us to keep a certain set of numbers in between a low and a high. All right, so you have three things that go into this, and you can see 5, 10, 20, 10, 10, 20. The first number that goes in is the number you're actually inputting into it. All right, the second number is your low value, and then see what it says. If the input is below this value, the function should return the value of low. So for example, when we input a 5, since it's not in the range of 10 to 20, it should input, or it should give us an output of 10, because that's the lowest value. And the last number is your high. If the input is above the value, then the function should return the value of high. So for example, 25 is obviously not between 10 and 20. So when we do that, it should return us a 20. All right, it should return it back to whatever the whatever the maximum value is there. So if we run this, it looks pretty good. Okay, so we want to limit 5 to the range of 10 and 20, so that should bump it up to a 10. Limiting 10 to the range of 10 and 20 gives you a 10. Limiting 15 to the range of 10 and 20, well, that's in the range, so that should give you a 15. Limiting 20 to the range of 10 and 20, good. And limiting 25 to the range of 10 and 20 gives us 25. So we have a slight error here in our program, mainly on the upper part of our program. So what we want to do is we want to analyze what it is that's making that not spit out that high value. And the main problem is there's too many if statements and stuff here. So it says if the input is greater than the low, then it should return the input. But 25 is greater than the lowest, so that means it's going to spit us out 25. And since 25 is greater than the low, it's never going to make it to the rest of this function. So what we want to do is we want to kind of, and I'll put this in block mode so it might be easier for us to see a little bit. What I'm doing is I'm going to drag out this other if statement here. All right, and we're going to tweak this, and what's going to end up is we're going to end up with an if else, and then an else. All right, and I'm going to drag out all of this stuff to start fresh. So what we want to do is we want to actually start with what is not inside the range. So if the input is less than the low, all right, so if the input is less than the low number, what do we want to happen? The number we input is less than low. What we want to happen is we want to get that output, what it tells us, to be the low number. All right, so if we put in anything below the lowest number, then what it should do is it should spit us out the lowest number. Okay, well, what happens? What's the other extreme? If the input is greater than the high, well, then what should happen? Then we should have the output should equal the high number. So what we've done is we've taken away the outside boundaries. When I say taken away, I mean we've accounted for the outside boundaries of being below the low number and then being below the or above the high number. So if we've taken care of everything outside of the range, the only thing that's left is what is inside of the range. And if it's inside of the range, then it should be exactly what the number is. Okay? So then our output should equal our input in that case. Now, a couple things we need to tweak as well. I forgot I need to add, before this if statement, I need to add a var output and just leave that blank. And then we don't want to return our input necessarily. We want to return our output. So let's run this and see if it works. Okay, so what do we have here? We have limiting 5 to the range of 10 and 20. Well, since 5 is below the low number, it should go up to a 10, which it does. 10, 15, and 20 are all in the range, so they should spit out exactly what they are, and they do. And then 25 is above the range, so that should bump down to the high, which it does. All right, so now we've rewritten this so that it spits out the numbers that actually fit in the range that we were assigned. So in Bubble 7, we're going to work with moving our turtle a little bit. So you can see what happens is it's giving it a starting location of 160 and for the X and 240 for the Y. And then basically it's got all these key functions that if you hit the left, it should take the X location and subtract 10, which basically moves it to the 10, moves it left 10 pixels, then to the right, and so on. All right, so your up, down, left, right keys are going to be what you have. Now the problem is they copied over the same constrain function that we created in the last bubble, but we need to work with the update turtle because you'll see there's a little bit of a problem here. As you go to the left, well, when you hit the end of the screen, you just keep going off. All right, and what we want to do is we want to constrain the turtle to only be in our screen. And once it hits the end, we want it to stop. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create, or we're going to add on to two variables here. So we're going to add on to our X lock and our Y lock variables. So X lock, we'll handle that one first. And what we want to do is we want to put in the constrain, or call the constrain function. Now what happens, all right, and you can see we have an input, we have a low, and we have a high here for this piece. Now what we need to do is figure out what do we want to happen when we hit the edge of the screen. So what are we actually looking to constrain here? We're looking to constrain the X lock. And then what should the X lock be between? Well, you can see here all the way to the left for X is 0. So we don't want it to go lower than 0, and we don't want it to go higher than 320. As you can see, that is the edge of the screen here on the right-hand side. It's hard to get to 320. Okay, so 320. So we don't want it to go past that. Then we're going to do the same exact thing for the Y lock. Okay, so we're going to call our constrain function. All right, and the same thing, we'll add 3, we'll make sure we have 3 bubbles here. So now we want to constrain the Y lock, or the Y location, to be between 0 and, so 0 is all the way up top, and then we have 450, and it's a little hard to see, but it's 450 all the way down there at the bottom. All right, so now we've constrained our turtle to make sure it fits between those two pieces. And actually the only thing we want to do here is we want to take this move to, and we want to move it to the bottom because we want to make sure we constrain it before it moves. So now let's see what happens. As we move all the way to the left, what should happen is you hit the edge of the screen, it should stop. All right, same thing to the right-hand side, it should stop. All right, if we move back in here, when it hits the top of the screen, it'll stop. And then same thing, it'll stop at the bottom. So what we've done is we've told the turtle to stop when it hits the edge of the screen, because we've constrained its variables between the pixels that we have. So what we want to do in Bubble 8 is we want to do what's called wrap the turtle, which in other words is, instead of it going to the edge of the screen and just stopping, we want that if it makes it all the way to the left side of the screen, that it ends up at the right side of the screen. Same thing, if it goes through the top, basically it will reappear at the bottom. So you can see they've taken out the constrain function and they've called it wrap. All right, and what we need to do is we need to create an if statement that basically tells the turtle that if it reaches the smallest number, that it needs to jump to the biggest number. So this is going to be a lot like the if statement that we wrote earlier. So we'll drag in an if statement here, and now we have if the input is less than the low. Okay, So now, remember when we did this before? When the 5 was less than the low, it should have returned the low value. But now we want it to do the opposite. When the turtle has reached, when like x is 0, what do we want to happen? We don't want to return the 0 piece. We want it to go all the way over here, and we want to return the high. So then therefore we want our output to be the high value. Okay? Else if the input is greater than the high function, all right? So in other words, if we were to go with the x's all the way to the right here, and it goes to be off the screen at 320, well, what do we want to happen? We don't want it to stay there. We want it to jump over here to the low part of our picture. So then our output should equal the low element. And else, well, if it's not less than the low or greater than the high, then we want the output to be equal to the input. All right, so now let's see what happens. As I scroll all the way to the left, when it hits the edge of the screen, it should jump all the way back to the right-hand side, all right, which it does. If I scroll all the way up to the top, what should happen? It should just start appearing at the bottom. All right, let's make sure it does it the other way too. So if I all the way to the right, it returns to the left. And if I go all the way down, then it starts at the top of the screen. So rather than stopping the turtle at the edges of the screens like we did in Bubble 7, in Bubble 8, we're teaching the turtle that when it hits the edge of the screen on one side, it should jump and reappear at the edge of the screen on the other side.